Good evening. Just like to start off by saying, or just expressing my appreciation for those of you who did pray. I know that that we wouldn't have come through a lot of situations that we did unless people had prayed, and that we wouldn't have had the success that we did unless people had prayed. And that was one thing that we recognized in this trip was that we needed to fully rely on the Lord, and that's shown through our prayer. How much we pray to the Lord shows how much we're depending on Him. And so I just want to thank you all for that, and also for those of you who supported in other ways through money. I know that this church helped provide some of the funds for the trip, and I'm grateful for that. Paul said in Romans 15, he said, "But as it is written, to whom he was not spoken of, they shall see, and they that have not heard shall understand." And that was kind of the mission of this trip, was that the gospel would be sent to people who had never heard the gospel before. Just a little background. These are just some numbers that I came up with before we started the trip. Just some things I was thinking about as we were preparing for the trip. Just realizing the magnitude of the field that's out there, even just in China. I'm sure that a lot of you have heard what God's been doing in China, that lots and lots of people have been getting saved, that the church has grown a lot over the last, I don't know, 50, 60, I guess, yeah, about 60 years. The church in China has just exploded. I think they said that in 1949, the church numbered about 1 million people in China, and now I've heard numbers anywhere from 60 to 120 million. And so the numbers have just been exploding. The gospel has been spreading all across China. They say that 20 to 30,000 people are coming to the Lord every day in China through people going out and sharing the gospel. But the population of China is 1.3 billion people, and so if you think probably some more accurate numbers are probably 70 to 80 million Christians in China. So that's, I don't know, there's probably some people who are better at math than me, but that's about 7, 8, 9% of the population. Probably closer to 7% of the population is Christian, which is higher than most other countries. 1.3 billion is the population of China. 1 billion of those people are Chinese people. And that's a huge number, 1 billion people. That's 1/7 of the world's population are Chinese people. But the population of China is 1.3 billion, and so 0.3 billion is 300 million. That's the population of the U.S. So there's 300 million, the population of the U.S., that amount of people in China that are not Chinese. And they're comprised of about 300 other little subgroups, the minority groups in China. People like Tibetans and Mongolians, Manchus, and all kinds of groups, Uyghurs, Hoi, Muslim people that where we were around, Tibetan people, and so many groups in China, many people groups in China, about 300 million people that are not Chinese that have not been very greatly affected by the revival that's been happening in China. Obviously somewhat, but not to a large degree like it has among the Chinese people. So there's a vast majority of people. If you think of the population of the United States is the third most populous country in the world. That amount of people in China that have not been very much affected by the gospel, that's a huge amount. And it would almost be the same, it would almost be the same for a Chinese person to go to some of these people groups, to learn their language, to learn their culture. It's almost as easy for them as it is for us to go to China, learn their language, learn the culture. The only easier thing is that they're already in China. They have the right to be in China. They have the right to travel anywhere they want in China. And so for Chinese people, it would be somewhat easier. But just so you get a picture that there's people that are not being reached out to. There's in northeastern China, there's the largest province in China is called Xinjiang, and it's mostly comprised of Uyghur people, and they're more like a Middle Eastern type people more than Chinese. They're almost all Muslims, and there's only a very, very, very small percentage of them that are Christians. Tibetan people live in the area of China known as Tibet, and also in the surrounding provinces. And there's a few, I think about 9 million Tibetans that live in China, and they're one of the most unreached people groups on earth. In China, I've heard numbers like 50 Tibetan Christians in China. And I mentioned that to somebody, and he said that sounds too high, to a Chinese missionary. He said he didn't think that there was that many Tibetan Christians in China. And Hudson Taylor, over 200 years ago, said that it would be easier to rob a lion of her cubs. He said it would be easier to go into a cave and rob a lion of her cubs than to get a convert out of Tibet. And so these, just so you get the picture of the need that's still in China. I know that some people have asked that, like, why do you need to go to China? Isn't there already like so many Christians there? And there are among the Chinese people, but there's still a great work that needs to be done among some of these unreached people groups that live in China. I'm going to attempt to show some pictures here. This is not a professional slideshow, and this is not a professional presentation, but I just wanted to share with you a little bit about what we did in China. Our mission was distributing gospel tracts. We had little gospel booklets about 50 pages long, and that gave a pretty good presentation of the gospel. Some of those we actually the elders ordered some of these tracts in English, ones that we handed out in Chinese, except for the ones that you see here. These are actually Chick tracts. Some of you might be familiar with those, but our mission was to distribute gospel tracts among a lot of these unreached people groups. We were mostly among Tibetan areas and Hui areas, the Hui, H-U-I, Hui Muslims, that were also very predominant in that area. So we branched out kind of out into some Tibetan areas, some Hui areas. And obviously all of these areas, there was a lot of Chinese people too, but some of these places it was, the majority of the people in these cities we went to were some of these minority groups. So we were out distributing these gospel tracts. So the first thing we did is, before we even ever left home, is we ordered a lot of these tracts. The team that came from here, from Canada and the U.S., there was 8 of us, and we carried in about 40,000 gospel tracts. Us guys from Canada, we ordered our tracts, and we had to stamp them all with contact information. So most of these tracts that went out were stamped with some type of contact information, an email address and a social media networking address. China has blocked Facebook. You can't get onto Facebook in China unless you have a special program that allows you to bypass China's blocking. But they have their own Facebook called QQ, and so there was a QQ address on the back of this. On the back of these tracts, that if they wanted to, they could contact a missionary living in China. So that was the first part of our adventure, was getting the tracts ready, and a lot of prayer went into it beforehand too. We seen God work in a lot of ways even before we ever left Canada. Even just the way that the whole trip came about. There was. I remember for a little while talking to my wife about it. I said, I really feel like I'd like to go back to China. I said next year, because it was last year when I was talking about it. I said, I really feel like I'd like to go back to China, because I'd been there before, doing this one other time. And then one day I came up to her and I just really said to her, I said, you know what? I said, I think God wants me to go to China next year. And the next day, and I hadn't talked to anybody else about it, just my wife. And the next day I got a text message from a brother, and he said, what would you think about going to China? He said, do you want to plan a trip? He said, you should plan a trip. We'll go to China. And that just seemed like confirmation. And what I hadn't known at the time was that 2 other brothers had been talking about it that day, and they they had both felt it laid on their hearts that they should go to China. And so they decided that they'd text me and ask me about that. And so we just felt, all of us had felt individually that we should go to China. And so that's how we felt, that the Lord is leading us to go there. And just all the time leading up to it, just seeing the Lord lead and direct in so many ways, and in provision, a lot of answers to prayer for provision. The church paid for part of the trip, and the rest of it came through unknown sources. A lot of anonymous gifts and things like that. I didn't have enough money to go until the week before I left, but we were just trusting the Lord that the Lord was going to provide. And I think it was just a few days before I left, actually, all the money came. And there's a lot of specific answers to prayer that I won't take time to share all those right now. But the Lord just really showed in a lot of ways that His hand was with this. This is a picture of the brothers that went here from Canada. You might recognize them. Henry Nelson, myself, and John Bayman. Henry Nelson and I, we were partners in China, because when we got to China, we all split up into teams of 2 and traveled out to different towns and cities. So Henry and I were together for the bulk of the trip. And so this is a picture of us at the airport. We left from Toronto, and even just right from the airport, just seeing God's blessing upon our trip, and showing that His blessing was with us. We each brought 3 bags of tracts into China. We had two full-size suitcases and a carry-on size suitcase full of tracts, and then we had a backpack with our own personal luggage in it. And we had a little bit of personal luggage scattered throughout the other suitcases, but the bulk of it was tracts. And our airline only was only going to allow us to bring one large suitcase and one carry-on, and then like a backpack. But we could pay for an extra piece of luggage. And so we had planned already months before that we were gonna bring an extra piece of luggage and pay for it. And as we were standing in line waiting at the airport, they started calling our flight number, and they said, "Who's on this flight? Who's on this flight?" And we said, "Well, we are." And they said, "Well, you got to come. We got to check you in right away." And so at first they started weighing our bags, but by the time I got up to the counter, they were like, "We have to process you quickly." They said, "Are your bags over 50 pounds?" And I said, "Not that I know of." And they said, "Okay, we don't even have time to charge you for your second bag. Just go. So you need to get on your flight." And it was weird because we had over an hour till our flight was supposed to leave, and we ended up sitting around and waiting for our flight. Our flight even got delayed and a little bit, and so we sat there and waited, and we don't know why they felt the need to rush us, and so much that they couldn't even charge us for our bags. So we just really seen that the Lord's hand was with us. So we got on our plane and left for Newark, New Jersey. Just an interesting little happening when we left Toronto. I'm actually not even sure if this picture was taken in Toronto, but this is one of the planes that we did leave on. But when we left Toronto, we were delayed because of some weather conditions, and so we ended up getting into Newark 20 minutes or a half hour late or something like that, and we ended up missing our connecting flight by 4 minutes. We ran up to the gate, and they told us, "You're too late," and we stood by the window and we watched our plane pull away from the ramp and take off to Beijing. And we were a little bit disappointed at first, but we believe that the Lord had reason for letting us miss our flight. We had to spend an extra night in Newark, and we got to share the gospel with some people. And we thought about it, that the Lord must have loved those people so much that He made us miss our flight to China so we could stay in Newark and share the gospel with them. And so who knows, maybe we'll see some people in heaven because we missed our flight by 4 minutes. But the next day, they were able to put us on a flight to Chicago, and from Chicago to Beijing. And so we flew into Beijing with each having about we were carrying 150 pounds at least, each of us, and most of that was gospel tracts. And as we were walking through, when we arrived in Beijing, and we were getting ready to go and pick up our luggage, we were all a bit nervous, and I saw a sign there, and it said items that are prohibited to bring through customs in China or whatever. And I quickly scanned over the list as I was walking by, and one of them was, it said something about literature that would affect the spiritual, moral, and psychological health of China. So basically they were saying they didn't want any printed literature that they felt would affect the people negatively. And for those of you who know a little bit about China, they would feel that the gospel would affect their people negatively. But so we knew that, and I knew from past experience that they wouldn't let things like this through customs. And so we had prayed, and we had prayed months in advance that the Lord would just help us get through customs without being found out. And shortly before we got to where our baggage claim area was, we saw this big sign, and the biggest word on there was relax, and we just felt like that was a word from the Lord as we were going to go and get our baggage. So we went through the customs, and actually as we were walking through, we seen that the security guard was pulling people just randomly and asking them to scan their luggage on the X-ray machine. And I just kept my eyes looking straight forward, and I just walked straight through. And John Bayman was behind me, and Henry was a few people behind him. And John was wearing some sort of slush pants, and I could hear his pants going shh, 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 as he was walking behind me. And I just kept looking straight ahead, and he pulled the guy out right in front of me and asked him to scan his luggage, and I just kept looking straight ahead and just kept walking. And I was listening for that shh, 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 and it was consistent. And I could hear he didn't pull John over. And as soon as I walked through the door, I turned around, and I seen that John had got through, and Henry was walking through, but they had pulled out guys in between them and guys behind them. And but they had left us alone, and so we got through. So that was a huge answer to prayer. We just felt blessed seeing that the Lord is blinding their eyes to what we were bringing in. This is the rest of the team. This picture is taken at the end of the trip, so if some of us look, I think the guy on the end there is sleeping. But we were all really tired. But this was the rest of the team. The guy on the far left is Denny Green, and he's the guy that I first contacted about going to China back in 2008, and he's the guy that I've gone with several times. He plans trips to China. He's been there about a dozen times doing work like this. And beside him is his son Gabriel, and beside him is his son Christian, and then is Stephen, a fellow from South Dakota, John Bamman, Henry Nelson, and Brad Miller, a guy from Virginia. And we made up the team that went out this year. This was a family that lives in China. The guy's name is Ben West. I'm not sure, were any of you here when he shared here at prayer meeting one night? Yeah, there's a few of you here. So some of you have met him when he was here about a year ago. And that's his wife. That's his wife Cindy, and those are his 3 children. Their names are Gabriel. The son's name is Gabriel, Ariel, and then the little daughter is Abby. And those are his children. He's the missionary family that lives in China. He lives in the province where we were primarily, in Gansu province, which is in central China. He lives there with his family. He's lived there for about 10 years. He was first in China when he was 19. He got married when he was 20, and him and his wife moved out to China. He's 29 now, so he's been there for 9-10 years. He speaks, reads, and writes Chinese fluently, and his wife also knows Chinese. His wife is Peruvian. You see, she's not Chinese; she's Peruvian. So their family also speaks Spanish. But he's the guy who organized things on the China side. He's the one who had all the maps and names of places, and he was the one figuring out routes for everyone that we were going to take. He knew which areas had been evangelized, which areas had Christians in them, which areas have had no gospel outreach, and so he was the one planning our routes and areas that we would go to distribute gospel tracts. We ate some strange food when we were in China. Yeah, very strange things. Yeah, so these pictures are actually taken in Beijing, and you don't see much of that out in the area where we were, but we saw a little bit of that. So after we landed in Beijing, we had a long train ride. We went out to central China, and it was an 18-hour train ride. So we had a lot of time to relax and fellowship together. We have a hard life as missionaries. We had really crammed quarters, but we were thinking, I'll bet the missionary Paul would have thought this was luxury to travel at such speeds and on beds to lay down in. Here's Hydro 1 in China. I'm not sure if you can see that. The guy's got his ladder right up against the hydro lines. Some interesting things we saw out there. Another way that we've seen the Lord working. Sometimes when we ran into difficult situations, it seemed like just at the right time, the Lord would send us somebody that knew English, and we were able to communicate quite well, actually. Like, it's amazing how much you can communicate even if you don't speak each other's language. We had phrase books with Chinese phrases in them, with English phrases beside them, so we could point to things that we wanted to say, and for the most part that worked really well. But sometimes we just ran into a difficult situation, and it just seemed like just at the right time, somebody just out of the blue would come up and be like, "Do you guys need help?" And somebody that spoke English really well. This little girl approached us in a train station, and she said, "Hello, may I help you? I can be your translator." And so she was one of our child translators. We had a few of those, and it was really neat to see that. Even when we came, when we first came into China in Beijing, we headed for the train station to take the train out west, and we weren't sure exactly how it was going to work because our train tickets had been purchased in advance, and we had a confirmation number, but I wasn't sure exactly how it would work or how I could communicate to them what it was that I wanted. And there just happened to be a guy on our bus who was also headed to the train station that also knew English. And it was just a real blessing to see just at every stage. At another train station that we were at in Xi'an, which is halfway between Beijing and the place, the Lanzhou was the big city in the west where we were headed out to. That was kind of like our base. And we were kind of in an in-between place where we needed to switch trains. And a guy just walked up to us and said, "Hey, where are you going?" And we said, "Lanzhou." And he said, "Well, follow me." And he went and bought us our tickets and then just walked off into the crowd. And so just at all these places where it was really needed, the Lord brought along somebody that spoke English. And that was a real blessing. It was a typical hotel room, a lot of luggage in a little room. This is a picture of me sleeping on a bus. This is how we normally traveled from place to place. I didn't take this picture, but it was interesting because all of our work was done at night. So we'd distribute tracts during the night because it's illegal and we didn't want people to see what we were doing. We would often sleep in the afternoon or in the evening sometime, and we would distribute tracts at night in a town. We'd lay them out on doorsteps or in bicycle baskets, in mailboxes, or just wherever we thought people were going to find them. And so you get really sleepy during the day. And so this was me sleeping on a bus, and I think it was actually on this bus ride. We were the road was so full of potholes and such big bumps in the road. I remember I had fallen asleep on this bus. I don't know how, but I fell asleep, and I woke up in the air. I was like literally out of my seat, and in the air. I woke up and banged my head. But we learned to live like the Chinese do. So in the areas where we were, there was it was very religious. A lot of the people there are affiliated with some type of religion out in the areas where we were. I'm sure in the larger cities like Beijing and Shanghai and Hong Kong, you'd find a lot of people who would say that they're atheists, people who've been to colleges and in schools and things like that. But in the areas where we were, there's a lot of religious people, a lot of Muslims, like I mentioned earlier, a lot of Muslims in some places, a lot of Buddhists in other areas. The Tibetans are are mostly Buddhist. It's very much ingrained in their culture and in their everyday life, their religion. So we saw a lot of mosques. We heard calls to prayer, and we always took that as a call for us to pray. So every time we heard a call to prayer, we'd kneel down and we'd pray. We'd pray for the Muslims and seek that they'd become. We were asking the Lord that they would become discontent with their religion and that they'd find their religion to fail them, and that they'd seek the Lord. So we saw a lot of mosques in some areas. We went into some of them. We were able to pray inside some mosques when they were empty. Buddhist demon. Just some of their artwork. Often where you'd see these colorful flags, you'd know that. I'm not sure if you can see that. Yeah, the colorful flags, you knew that it was a Buddhist area, and often they'd have them from their houses. You'd see all these colorful flags, and you'd know that this is, okay, we're heading into a Buddhist area now. Here's a picture of some Tibetan monks. These are men who give themselves to their religion. They don't marry. They study their religious books, and they're called on by the people to perform religious ceremonies and things like that. A lot of them enter monasteries at a young age. These guys were really young, and we've seen some little boys, 7, 8 years old, who were monks. So you saw a lot of signs of their religion all over the place. So these are the people that we were mostly reaching out to. Some of the experiences that we had while we were out there. I think it was the second town that we went to. So it was our second night out, and we called it crumbing what we were doing. We were distributing tracts. We called it crumbing because crumb was our code word for tracts. We tried not to use, just in case there was people around that spoke English. Sometimes we ran into cops that spoke English, and so we tried to be careful the kind of words that we used. So we called tracts crumbs, and so what we were doing at night was crumbing. We'd crumb a city. That was just a lot of terms that we used. But so the second city that we were going to crumb, it was a small town, and normally what our routine was is that when we got into a town on a bus, the bus would come to a bus station, and we'd go inside the bus station. We'd ask when is the next bus leaving for. We'd name our next town. When is the first bus in the morning going to this place? Because we don't want to leave first thing in the morning before everyone got up and found out what we did. And so we'd try and get the first bus out of town. And then they'd tell us, and we'd buy bus tickets and then get out of town first thing in the morning. But this second town we were in was small, and it didn't even have a proper bus station. So the bus just dropped us off on the main street and then took off. And we had nobody to ask, really, when's the next bus leaving in the morning? And so we really didn't know what to do. So we started walking around. We found a hotel to stay in. You could tell they weren't really ready for tourists to come in. We ended up sleeping in a room that was just full of dust. But we went out on the streets and we started asking people, pointing to a phrase in our phrase book, like, where's the bus station? And some people didn't understand. And one guy like kind of pointed to us, and he said he motioned to us, and he was going to lead us to it. So he brought us up down some back little streets and around the side of the town, and then to just a small little courtyard. And sure enough, there was a bus in there, and you could tell it was a bus station, but it was totally deserted. And so we were like walking around, and he was knocking on some apartments that were nearby and couldn't talk to anybody. You could just tell no one had been there. The bus station was full of dust, and you could just tell it wasn't being used. And so we were like, well, how in the world are we going to get out of this town in the morning? What happens if we get caught? Like, there's police in this town, and it's a small town, so people are going to figure out pretty quick who it was that did what we did. And so we just, from the time we got into the town, we just started praying, Lord, please help us get out of this town in the morning. And we had no idea, like, how many buses come through this town in a day. When do they come? Do they come in the morning, at noon, or in the evening? Do they only come every other day? We don't know. And we tried to ask some people, and nobody could seem to help us. And so we just took it to the Lord in prayer. And so we crumbed the town that night. And we just decided, okay, we're going to get up at 6 o'clock in the morning. And so we did. We got up at 6. We woke up the lady who was working at the hotel. We told her we were leaving. We gave her our key. She gave us our deposit, and we just walked out of the hotel. We walked down the main street, and it was just dark. There was no street lights. we walked up to the main street where the bus had dropped us off the day before, and we were kind of looking around, and there was nothing. And so we thought, well, let's just walk. And so we started walking through the town and down some back roads, and some headlights started driving towards us. And it was a bus, and it stopped. It stopped before it got to us, and the bus driver hopped out, and we asked him. We just started shouting the name of the town we were going to next, and he was like, yeah, get on the bus. And so we got on the bus, put our luggage in there, and a few minutes later we drove off, and he took us to the next town we were supposed to go to. And that was just an amazing answer to prayer. And we've seen a lot of things like that happen, just where we had a problem, we asked the Lord about it, and the Lord took care of us. In another town we were in, it was actually our second time being in that town, and so it makes you look a little bit suspicious. And so we wanted for sure to get out first thing in the morning, and we needed to take a taxi because the bus station was quite a ways away, and we're hauling heavy luggage, and we didn't want to walk, and the roads were all snow covered. And so we were with 2 other brothers that time, and the one guy said, well, how in the world are we going to get a taxi? He said, taxis don't run at this time in the morning. And I just said, well, let's pray. And so we prayed, and we asked the Lord for 2 taxis because there was 2 of us. We had lots of luggage, so we asked the Lord for 2 taxis to come by that morning. And we walked out of our hotel. We walked up to the street, and 2 taxis pulled right up in front of us. And so we took the taxi to the bus station, and we got out of that town. In the third town that we were in, it was a city called Lintan. Oh, sorry, here's some more Buddhist pictures. And this isn't a Buddhist temple, and this isn't a mosque. This is a Christian church. We in the town that we were in, Lintan, this was the first place we saw a church out west in China, and it was actually interesting. The Lord blessed us in this town. We had a Christian taxi driver. We got a taxi. We asked him to take us to a hotel, and we were driving down the street, and we drove past this church building. And I was looking at it, and I was kind of shocked to see a church here. And he saw me looking at it, and he just started pointing up and saying something. I don't know what he was saying, but I kind of got the impression that maybe he was saying he went to that church or something. So I pointed up to the church, and I pointed to him, and he said, yeah. And so I pulled out my phrase book. It's actually a Christian phrase book, and there's a phrase in there, are you born again? And I showed it to him, and he's like nodding. He said, yeah. And I said, hallelujah. And he said, hallelujah. And then he started jabbering on and on and on, and my most used phrase in China was "ting budong," and that means I don't understand. And so I had to just keep telling him that. I wish I knew what he was saying though, but he just kept talking away, and I wish we could have fellowshiped. But so it was a blessing to see that. It was almost refreshing after seeing all the minarets of these mosques and all these Buddhist temples and prayer flags, then to see a cross and to see a church. This was the inside of. We walked inside the church. It was empty, but we sat there and we prayed for the Christians in the city. The fourth town that we went to was a city called Huzhua, and it snowed. It snowed the night before, and it snowed into the next day, and the whole trip while we were on our way to the city Huzhua. And so by the time we got there was quite a layer of snow on the ground, and it actually almost shut the town down. There was no buses running, and so we tried, as soon as we got to the town, we tried buying bus tickets to our next town, and they just told us all the buses are stopped, like there's no buses running. And so that was another matter we had to take to the Lord in prayer. If there's no buses running, how are we going to get out of town in the morning? And we knew we had to work because we didn't come to China to just sit around. And so that was another thing that we took to the Lord in prayer. But when we got to our hotel in this town, we signed into the hotel, and we always have to fill out a registration form to let the authorities know who's in their town and how long they're staying for and so on. And the fella who was in the hotel, he spoke a bit of English, and he handed us our room key, and he said, stay in your room until the police come. The police are going to come and question you. And we were all like, oh no. So we ran to our room. We hid all of our tracks. We took them out of our suitcases and put them in little cupboards and little places where we thought they might not look, and we just prayed that the Lord would protect them. The police came into our room and questioned us for a little while. They wanted to know what we were doing, where we had been, and some of the questions we were able to just answer around and without lying, and some some questions they asked pretty specifically, and we had to give them specific answers, but mostly they wanted to know about our work. I think they were afraid that we were journalists and that we were going to come interview the people, and in China they're a little bit afraid of that because some of the minority groups have been discriminated against, and they've been abused by the Chinese people, and so they don't want people to know about that. They don't want it to get out, and so they're always afraid that journalists will come in and report their stories and things like that. So, and a few hours later, some more policemen came. There was 2 that came the first time, 4 that came the next time. They said, "We're coming to search your room," and we were when we'd hand the tracts out, we'd fold 2 tracts together, and we'd put a rubber band around them. And so for like an hour or 2 every evening, we'd sit and we'd tie up these tracts to get ready to throw them out that night. And we'd just been getting ready to do that. We'd unzipped some of our suitcase. We were getting ready to pull the tracts out and start folding them up. And I just said to one of the brothers, I said to Henry, I said, we should be really careful. I said the police are kind of, they've been here, they've questioned us. I said, let's just be really careful. Let's just hide it as much as possible so that if somebody comes in, we can cover it up quick. And the words just came out of my mouth, and there was a knock at the door, and it was the police again. And they said, "We're coming to search your room." And so we had already pulled the tracks out and everything like that, so he just shut the suitcase, threw a jacket over top of it. And they came and they looked around our room a little bit, but they didn't look in any of the cupboards, they didn't look in our luggage. But they found my camera, and they started flipping through the pictures. I think they must have just been afraid that we were journalists, because they told us that we weren't allowed to talk to any of the people, we weren't supposed to take pictures, we weren't supposed to walk around the town. And there was a huge monastery in this town, and a monastery is almost like a little village. It was a Buddhist monastery. They have a big temple, and kind of all around the temple they have like dwelling places for the monks to live in. So there's a lot of monks in this town. So they said, don't talk to any monks, don't talk to any Tibetans, don't take pictures, and don't go to the monastery. So they left. They pretty much just wanted us to stay in our room, but we knew that what we were doing there wasn't legal in the first place. So that night we went to the monastery and left them some presents and shared the gospel with them. But the Lord kept us from being found out. We never received, even though in that town, that was probably one of the places where we felt the most pressure, from the police. The police were watching us. There was a lot of police in the town. We ended up coming back to that town 3 times and crumbing in that town. I always felt nervous going back there because of what happened, but the Lord always helped us. We did have some other run-ins with police too. Here's 2 other policemen that stopped us, and so I asked for a picture with them. I always felt like that helped lighten up the mood and maybe help them trust us a little bit more. I was just act happy and tell them how much we love China and how beautiful it is, and ask if I could get my picture taken with them and things like that. They always seem to like that, and they always seem to take it easy on us. But we were taking a bus to a town, and in between the bus had to stop somewhere, turn off on a little exit, and so they made us get off the bus because foreigners weren't allowed in this town, so we had to spend some time with the police there. We got to share a little bit about the Lord with them. There's a lot of people in China. Often just see that, and you see big groups of people like this, and here's a marketplace, and you just see so many masses of people, and sometimes it's hard to remember. I shared about some numbers earlier, numbers like 1.3 billion or 300 million. Those numbers don't mean anything to us, right? And people aren't just numbers. And so sometimes I look at a crowd of people like that and just think about it, that each one of these people are souls. And maybe we're going to go out into that town tonight, we're going to lay out some tracts, and maybe it's going to land at some of their doors. And so we took a lot of time to pray for these people. These people that were going to be getting our tracts, asking that the Lord would help them find them, that they'd read them, that they'd come to a good understanding of the gospel and be saved. Because we don't want to lose the focus of what it's really about. It's not about getting the job done. It wasn't about tossing out so many tracts every night. It wasn't about making sure you get to so and so many towns before your time is up. It was about reaching out to people. It was about desiring souls to be saved and spreading the gospel. This was a little bit funny. Henry and I, we decided, we were walking through a town near a marketplace, and there was a lady selling helium balloons, we thought, hey, we could use these balloons. We could tie some tracks to them and just send them out over the marketplace. And turns out it was a bad idea. We bought 3 balloons, and it took 3 balloons to lift up one track. It never made it more than 5 feet off the ground, and just kind of like sailed over into this market area, and just so we ran away. But we thought maybe the Lord would use that. We had a lot of different experiences. Some are funny now to look back on, but they were scary at the time. Just things like running into the police or being worried about certain situations, things that were going to happen, and realizing, oh, it was nothing after all. One thing that happened, it's a little bit humorous now to look back on it, but at the time it wasn't so funny. Maybe some of you know, I have a fear of dogs. I'm not a fan of dogs. I've been chased by dogs and bitten by dogs and things like that. I don't enjoy being around dogs. But one night we had been out in a residential area, and a lot of the residential areas are different than what we have here. They don't have big wide roads where you can drive up. A lot of the times there's just little alleyways. We often wondered, like, how do you share your address with somebody? Like, you're walking down tiny little, and it's like a maze, just these little narrow alleyways with doors on the sides and so on. But anyways, we had been crumbing down this little alleyway, and it was a dead end, so we had to turn around and walk back. And there was a wall on either side of us, and the wall was, I don't know, maybe 8 feet high or something like that. As we were walking by it, this big dog, it was really big, jumped on top of the wall and started barking just ferociously. And it was, I mean, it looked like a wolf. But it looked like it could have easily jumped off the wall and started chasing us. We just ran. And as I was running faster than Henry, and Henry was calling out to me, he said, "Victor, I lost my shoe." And I thought, oh no. We just kept running. I was like, well, what can we do? And eventually we stopped, and the dog was still barking. It was a ways down, but he could still see us, and he's barking and barking. And we were thinking, man, he's going to wake somebody up. And what are we going to do about Henry? It didn't even occur to me we should go back and get it. I was thinking, well, we're going to have to find a taxi, and Henry's going to have to go back to the hotel, and I'm going to have to be out here crumbing by myself. And he's like, I think I really need my shoe. And I was like, but so we prayed about it. And what came to my mind was David and Goliath. David going up against Goliath, and that's what I felt like. There's this big dog, and they're not chained up. They don't have dog laws like they do here in Canada, and so I was just feeling pretty small and insignificant, and I wasn't sure what to do. But then I thought, David and Goliath. I was like, I need some stones if I'm going to come up against this giant, and I looked around. I didn't see any stones, but there's a pile of bricks, and so we each took a brick in our hands. And I ran at the dog, and I threw this brick, and it went right over its head, and the dog jumped back to see what it was that I threw, and Henry ran and grabbed his shoe, and we took off running, but we both felt a little bit shaky the rest of the evening. Yeah, you'll have to come and talk to me some other time. Often different experiences come to my mind just as time goes on. I think Lisa heard some news story just yesterday of something that happened while I was out there. But so eventually we came and we met back up with the rest of our team in Lanzhou. I think it had been shared here at prayer meeting that 2 of the guys had been caught. That team had gone further out west in an area that's very Muslim, and they were actually on their way back to Lanzhou to get restocked because they were running out of tracks, and so they were getting ready to take a train, and they got stopped by the police and brought into the police station, and they were searched. They found their tracks. They were interrogated for 2 days and kept at the police station, and they found their cell phones and all the rest of the team's contact information, as well as the contact information of the missionary who's living out there, and that was potentially dangerous for him because if he got found out, he could get kicked out of China for good and not be allowed to come back. And so we were all really praying for that when we found out about it. But there was some miscommunication there. between us while we were in China. Some of us thought that our missionary friend Ben West, we all called him Eugene. That's his China name. He goes by that name in China. We all heard that he had taken off to Hong Kong, and so I think word had spread out to here that he was off in Hong Kong, that he had to leave the country, but that wasn't so. He did leave his home city, and he went out to Lanzhou and was hanging out there for a while, just to kind of wait and see if the police were on to him or not. But it seemed like everything was okay by the time we left. He switched phones. They weren't able to track him by his phone anymore. So we were able to spend some time with him yet before we left. But these brothers that got caught, the police they nullified their visas, so they weren't able to just travel around in China anymore. They brought them to Lanzhou, and put them in a hotel so that they'd know where they were. But these guys, they left that hotel, went to another hotel without signing out of the first hotel, and so that second hotel kind of became their base, and some guys resupplied them with tracts, and they went through the city of Lanzhou, which is quite a large city. I think it's like 2 million people or something like that. And so they started going to the universities in this city and crumbing the universities, because the next week school is going to come back in session, and a lot of new students are going to be coming to these colleges and universities, and so they were spreading out gospel tracts in these areas, and so they were still able to do that even though they had been caught. So we met back together with the team in Lanzhou, and from Lanzhou we flew out to Beijing. We flew back to Beijing for the last 3 or 4 days of our trip. We met some Christians in Beijing. We had a chance to spend some time with some people from a church there, and they were very, very generous and hospitable people. They pretty much paid for our whole time in Beijing. They paid for our hotel. One of the guys in the church owned a restaurant, and he said you can come and eat at the restaurant as many times as you want for free. And so we did do that a few times, and they drove us around. They brought us to and from the airport. They paid all of our fees, and they were really a big blessing to us. And the one guy on the far left, he was one of the pastors of the church. There's a few pastors of that church. His name is David, and that's his little daughter Grace beside him. The other fellow was also from the church. His name is Mark, and that was his wife and his son. And these two guys were two of the fellows that drove us around a lot. And even though Mark spoke some English, and so we were able to fellowship with some of these brothers, and it was really good. Some of them served as interpreters. This is the picture of a church, and you can't really tell, but the one building that has the green sign is a restaurant. And actually, sorry, this actually isn't the picture of a church. I just realized that now. But this is actually across the road from the church. But this is kind of what the church would have looked like, just over on the other side, just shops like that. There was a restaurant, and to get to the church, you had to go through the restaurant and then into like the back kitchen area, and then there was a stairwell going upstairs, and then on the third story was where the church met. This is a church in Beijing. They were actually a government-registered church, so the government knew about them and that they were there. And they said that every once in a while a government worker would come in and sit on a service and listen to what they were preaching and what was going on there. The church is still restricted in a lot of ways in China. The registered churches, they have limitations on things that they can do, things that they can preach, and a lot of their practices and activities are restricted. They're only allowed to meet certain days of the week and for a certain amount of time. They're not allowed to evangelize. They're not allowed to reach out to other people. They're not allowed to meet in their own homes and things like that. And if they kind of halfway follow these guidelines, then the police don't bother them very much. But they do have illegal work that they do. This pastor, Pastor David, he was one of the pastors of this government-registered church, but he also pastored 4 underground churches. And so that was, and I've heard that that's somewhat more common, that there'll be some churches that are registered with the government, but they have a lot of underground activity that they do. Another thing that this church does is they have a school, an elementary school for children, and it's a Christian school, and it's in English. It's an English school. They teach the kids English, and all of their curriculum is in English, and that's it is that's an illegal aspect of their ministry and what they do. I guess they did have some type of a relationship with the local government, and so the government was allowing them to run this school, like the lower level government. But from what we heard, they had been receiving pressure from some of the higher ups, and they were pressuring them to close this school down. And so they had actually just received notice that they had to be out of their building. The school had to be out of their building in a month, and they weren't going to be allowed to use it anymore. So they were going to be moving out to the mountains now and doing school in a place out there. So they felt like God was leading them to continue, but to just move somewhere else. I had the opportunity to preach at that church in Beijing, and through an interpreter. You can see him there. His name was Peter Lee, and he was a huge blessing. He spoke English really well, and it was encouraging to hear from him, hear some stories from him, things that God was doing and how God had worked in and through his life. He had been arrested far out in western China, even quite a bit further west than we had been. He had been doing some gospel work out there some years ago and had been arrested, and the police were threatening him with jail time. And he had told the police, he said, "No, you can't do that." I think they said they were going to shut him up for 7 years or something like that. He said, "You can't put me in prison for 7 years." He said, "My God is the one who's in control, and the only way you can throw me in prison is if He wants that." And he said he didn't think that the Lord did, and so the police ended up letting him go, and he didn't spend any time in jail. Another thing that he had done was he had facilitated the smuggling in of a lot of Bibles. They had been a lot. It was a large number of people. It was either 300 or 400, I forget the exact number, of people who came in on one jet loaded with Bibles, and all of their luggage was just Bibles. And so it was his job to meet these people at the airport. And he had told one of the brothers from the church before he left. He said, if I go to prison, he said, "You take care of my children." And he went off to the airport to meet all these believers with Bibles. And he said all of them got through. It was like 300 or 400 people all got through customs without being caught. And I think that was back in '97 or something like that, and the persecution of Christians was a lot more severe back then. But the Lord kept him, and he was just sharing a lot of his testimonies with us, and it was a blessing to be with him, fellowship with him, and pray with him. There's one danger that the church in China faces is false doctrine coming in and cults springing up. There's a strange cult called Eastern Lightning in China. They believe that Jesus has returned, that the second coming of Christ has already happened, and that he's in the form of a Chinese woman. And so I think there's about 1 million people that follow this lady, and they use force and brainwashing to bring people into their cult and join their movement. And his wife had been convinced by some people to join their movement. Her name was Lydia, and she left him and she left their children. He hasn't seen her or heard anything from her in 6 or 7 years, but he said he prays for her every day that the Lord will bring her back. So that's one. If you think about it, pray for his wife Lydia, that she'll come back to them. He has 2 children, but the Lord opened up an opportunity there for me to preach, and so I was able to preach there on a Sunday morning. And the whole group of us, we did some singing, and it was a blessing being there with other believers. We had some opportunities to share the gospel with people, just one-on-one. I know during the first part of the trip, I was very apprehensive to do that. I felt like we're supposed to be secretive while we're here. We're not supposed to be very open. Like, who knows who you're talking to, if you're talking to an undercover policeman. I've heard stories about that, people who had come on trips just like this and had accidentally handed a tract to an undercover policeman and had been caught and things like that. And so I felt apprehensive about that. But a little ways into the trip, I felt like No, that's not what we came to China for. We didn't come to China to keep our mouths shut, and so I took opportunities where I was able to, with taxi drivers or sitting on a bus with somebody. We spent a lot of hours traveling, usually 3, 4, sometimes 5 hours a day on a bus, traveling from one city to the next. And so sometimes you sit with somebody for quite a while, and we had opportunities to share the gospel with people, give them gospel tracts. We had a section in our phrase book on just phrases you can use in witnessing to people. I brought a Bible with me to China that was an English and Chinese parallel Bible, and so I was able to show people verses and point them to scriptures, and it was a blessing. This is a picture of John and I when we were back in Beijing, sharing with some Muslim guys. They seen us come out of the church where we were, and they owned a restaurant just 3 or 4 doors down. They were telling us, you're supposed to come and eat at our restaurant, and we told them we had just eaten, but they wanted us to come in and eat some more. So we ended up walking over there and talking with them a bit. They didn't speak any English, but it's just amazing how much you can communicate with somebody if you really want to. And we were able to share a lot of scriptures with them, and even just out of fascination with the Bible, they were looking at it and reading it, and so we were able to share truth with them. And probably for a lot of these people, it's the first time they've ever heard. Maybe not for these guys, but for a lot of those people, it's the first time they'd ever heard the message of the gospel. While we were in Beijing, we went to go see the Great Wall of China. When we came into China, we marked. And when we had applied for our visas, we applied for them as tourists. When we came into China, we had to fill out a customs form and an immigration form. We told them we were coming in as tourists, so we visited the Great Wall, so we weren't lying. And the last thing we did in China is we went to visit the school that the church helps supports, and a lot of the teachers go to this church. And there's actually a man from the church who started this school and who funds a lot of it. So we went and visited them and we spent some time with the children. It was neat to see a Christian school in China, and they had Bible verses all over the walls and pictures of missionaries. Seek the true treasure, for where your treasure is, there will your heart be also. And they were just filling their children's minds with scripture. It was a small school. There was only 12 students. I think they said it was down from 25. But these were the students that were in the school, and some of the teachers. We were able to spend some time with them and interact with a lot of the children who spoke English. And they're actually looking for teachers. If anybody feels called to go to China, they're looking for teachers. They're willing to pay a good wage for somebody who wants to come and teach classes there. And straight from the school, we went to. They drove us to the airport, and we left for home. That's all the pictures. That's a little bit of the gist of our trip, and a few things that the Lord did. Does anybody have any questions about the trip? I don't know if that all flowed very well or not, but if you have any questions, just feel free to ask. Yeah. Oh, okay, I'm not sure if everyone heard that, but the question was that if we were going out at night, walking through back alleyways and stuff like that, were there danger of gangs or dangerous people being out there? Not really. The law is pretty strict out there, and they keep a lot of those things under control. They actually say it's a lot safer to walk out in a city in China than it is here in North America. They said there'd be a lot more risk here in North America walking through a street at night than in China. So it was actually really safe. We didn't have the only thing I was scared of was dogs. But and even most of the time they were behind walls. So yeah, and it was very safe. Okay, the question was that he saw a picture of the church, and he said if it's illegal for them to be there, like, is that okay? I mean, it is and it isn't. Like I mentioned before, there are a lot of restrictions on the church. I asked one of the missionaries about it, and he said he said that some of these Christians have just learned to live with the restrictions. And so, like, if they're not going out and openly evangelizing, like out preaching on the streets and things like that, if they're not making a big ruckus, then the government doesn't really bother them that much. I mean, the government is really against all religion, but they let the Muslims exist because the Muslims it's just part of their culture and their lifestyle. It's not like they're actively seeking people to join them or anything like that. So as long as they're not being very, very open and very bold, then the government just leaves them alone. I mean, obviously some of them are going out and still preaching the gospel, but doing it more undercover. But I guess in some areas it's different. It all depends on who's in government, even like locally, who the mayor is, who's the police chief, or the chief of police, and like depending on who these people are will depend on how strict certain areas are. So some areas it's more lenient, and then a few counties over it might be more restricted. So I guess in that area it was a bit more lenient. But he said too, like if those people were doing what you guys were doing, they'd get in trouble. He said they might even get questioned or something like that because of what we did, thinking that maybe the Christians had done it, the Christians from that area. So I mean, they might. So yeah, as long as they're not doing anything really bold and in everybody's face, then the government kind of just leaves them alone, unless they notice a lot of activity going on. Anybody else? If you have any questions for me later too, you can just feel free to ask me. All right. Thank you very much.